Guys, welcome back. Doing something a little different today. I was a little hesitant at first, but I said, you know what, why not? This is a fishing channel, so why not show the folks at home my process of how I paint Blastin'Bass lures. Right now, I'm just laying down a basic coat of opaque white, and I'm getting it ready for paint. This is a new pattern that I'm doing. It's not a terribly difficult pattern, but as with all patterns, it's just one that you just have to pay attention to because you can pretty much ruin any paint job if you're not careful, if you don't have trigger control on the airbrush, so forth and so on. So like I said before, this is a spook that I'm painting right now. It's a 5.5 inch, 1.1 ounces. Great spook, by the way. I use them all the time, and yeah, it's one of my go-to lures. So like I said, I'm laying down some opaque white, and I will explain the next step in a second. And the reason why I'm doing commentary is because I'm airbrushing and I don't want to inhale airbrush dust because, as you guys can imagine, that is hazardous to your health, and I didn't want to risk it. Maybe I will in future videos if you guys, like this aspect of my videos of me showing you how I paint some of my lures. Um, so yeah, as of now, I'm not gonna do that because I want to preserve my lungs. So I'll get back to you in the next step. So between each of the coats that I will put on, I use a hair dryer to dry the paint. I don't have it on high heat, I have it on medium so as not to crack the paint. And it's very important that you oscillate that hair dryer because if you concentrate that heat, that's when you'll get cracks in it. But as long as you oscillate it and have it at a reasonable distance from the lure, you will be fine. And yes, I am airbrushing in my kitchen. I'm using an airbrush booth, so I really don't have to worry about airbrush dust going anywhere or anything like that. And I've been doing this for a while and I haven't had any problems, so it works out. Okay, so now I'm gonna be putting some bone over the entire lure. This is a bone color that I mixed myself. It took me a while to come up with this bone color, but I finally got a bone color that I really like, and it's a really, really good bone color. I'm really satisfied with it. So I'm going to be covering the entire lure in bone, a good thick coating of bone. And this is going to be uh, predominantly bone. It's going to be a bone lure, and I'm going to throw some sepia in there, or sepia, however you say it. I'm going to be throwing some of that in there, as you'll see in a moment. And I usually do runs of like 10 to 20 lures at a time, but for the sake of this video, I'm only painting one. And since it's a new pattern, I figured why make multiple if I don't even I don't even know how it's, well, I know how it came out now, but during the making of this, I had no clue how it was going to turn out. I had an idea, just by the vision, but it ended up coming out wonderful, as you'll see. So I want you guys to take note of the even strokes that I'm having across the lure. You never want to have that airbrush sitting in one space for too long, and you do not want to have the airbrush really close to the lure because that's when you're going to have paint blowing everywhere, and then pretty much you're going to have to get some alcohol or some airbrush cleaner or something like that, and you're going to pretty much have to start over again. You're going to ruin the lure. So never, really have the airbrush that close to the lure. And you also want to have your pressure down at a reasonable psi. Like right now I'm operating at maybe 15-20 psi at all times. I used to do it at 40 psi, but once I switched airbrushes, I no longer do that. And I also do thin my paints. I do not use airbrush thinner. I use distilled water, and it's been working fine for me. I know some people say, um, you know, they just have mixed feelings about it, but I've been doing it for a while, and I've had no problems, and I've used both, and distilled water, and works perfect for me. And like I said before, always hit it with the hair dryer in between coats. I think I might have put like 2 or 3 coats of bone on here, so in between each I will hit it with the hair dryer. I never just lay all of it on at one time, especially if I know I'm going to be laying on a thick coat, because that's when you're going to have problems with paint blowing everywhere, and you don't want that. So patience is key, especially when painting these lures, because you can really ruin a lure really quick. And so yeah, like I said, in between each layer, I'm just hitting it with the hair dryer really quick. Doesn't have to be super, super, super dry, but just firm enough to where as when you start to lay on the next layer, it's not going to be blowing everywhere. So here I'm holding up a piece of paper towel so you can see the difference in color, and you can really see that distinguishable bone color against the paper towel. Okay, so now I'm getting ready to lay on a pattern over this bone base, and what I'm using as a stencil, like netting pattern, scale pattern, whatever you want to call it. I'm actually using it's the thing that you get in the grocery store that garlic comes in. So that's what I'm using to lay down in this pattern. Lay down in this pattern. To lay in this pattern with, and I'm gonna be using some sepia, as you will see in a moment. So to hold down this mesh, what I'm going to be using is their alligator clips. They're the same type of clips that come on the helping hands that I'm using to hold the lure with. So that's what I'm using to hold down the mesh with. And just a quick tip, it's very important to really take your time doing this, because you can scratch the lure and you don't want that. So when you're putting on this mesh, there's 2 things that you got to do. Just make sure that you're stretching that mesh enough so the pattern can really pop and show up, and it just doesn't look all bunched together, because you want that pattern to be like spaced out so it really looks nice. And 2, like I said before, you want to be careful when you're putting these clips on, because you can scratch the lure. And this is what it looks like when I have all the clips on. And don't be afraid to use a lot of clips, because you really want to make sure that there's no empty spaces, or there's no spaces where it's not completely stretched over the lure, because paint will blow underneath and it will just look absolutely terrible. You'll get paint blotches, and the pattern will come out all wonky, and yeah, you're pretty much gonna have to do it again. And take note that I am using gloves during this process, because you do not want any oils from your hands getting on that lure, because it will affect how that epoxy lays on later. Okay, so now I'm going to be using some detailed sepia. It's from Createx. It's part of their Wicked line. And I especially make sure that I thin these paints from the Wicked line, because they are slightly thicker than the normal ones. So here I am mixing the paint. I used a little bit of distilled water to thin the paint with. And you really don't need that much. I pretty much eyeball it at this point. I really wanted the consistency of, let's say, like skim milk or something like that. You don't want it too watery, but you really don't want it too thick either. And over time, you'll just know what the paint looks like, and automatically you'll just know how it's gonna come out of that airbrush. So yeah, a little paint goes a long way, especially when you're not blasting it at a high PSI. Okay, so I'm gonna load the paint in, and I'm gonna start laying in uh, this detail with this mesh. And it's at this point in the lure making process that you really, really, really want to have trigger control, because especially, I mean, with the mesh like this, it's really not that crucial, but it kind of is, especially when you get to the sides, because you really want a nice fade down the sides. Like, you don't want harsh lines or anything like that. Um, so trigger control is very important, and also not having your compressor on a high PSI. Unless you have that great of trigger control, then by all means go for it. Shoot at 40, 45, 50 if you want. But for me, like I said, I actually turned down the PSI to around 15, sometimes even 12. Like, just as long as the paint is coming out of there even, I'm not getting any sputtering or anything like that from lack of PSI, then I'm good all the way. So like I said, trigger control is very important, and over time you will just get better at it. And yeah, it's just one of those things that you just have to practice. So as you saw, to start off with, I am laying down that sepia pretty thick on top. You really want to make sure that you get a good line going down the center. So I pretty much just I use the um, the gills, like the front gills, as like a guide, and I use the base of the helping hands also to help me steady that lure, so it's not bouncing all over the place, and just really keep steady pressure on the trigger so you get even lines, so spots aren't darker than others. And as always, in between layers, I'm always hitting it with that hair dryer. And I didn't mention before that when I'm laying in that the back, the stripe or whatever you want to call it, down the back, to really have even strokes all the way across the back of that lure, because you don't want the airbrush staying in one spot too long, because that's also how you get spots that are darker than others, and then you're gonna have to end up making the rest of the back of the lure darker than you originally wanted to. So it's very important to have even strokes and even trigger pressure across the lure as you're making those passes down the back of the lure. Okay, so now I'm going to be doing the sides, which I consider to be the most important part, because this is really where I think anyway that the lure is more aesthetically pleasing when you get that nice fade effect down the side and you don't have any harsh lines or anything like that. And the way that you don't get any of those harsh lines is, number one, you really don't want to be blasting on the paint. You want to be shooting at a lower PSI, and you don't want to hit that lure dead on with the paint. You want to hold that airbrush at an angle. Maybe I'm holding it at like a 45-degree angle, I would say, but never dead on. And like I said before, you want to be giving it nice and even sweeps across the entire lure, and just take it easy on this part, no need to rush it, don't blast the paint on. Just take your time on this and really get a nice fade down the side. I'm gonna hit this real quick with the hair dryer, and we're gonna see what it looks like. Okay, so the moment of truth. During this point in time, I had no clue how the lure was gonna come out. I had an idea of how it was gonna come out because I've used this mesh before, and the patterns that I've done, they came out good. So I had an idea, but I didn't know that it was gonna come out like this. It really came out nice. Came out really nice and sleek. It's not overly complicated, but it's not extremely simple. It's the perfect medium, with that bone and that detailed sepia. It's really a nice color combo, and like I said before, I really like the bone color that I mixed. It's killer bone color. I love it, and yeah, it's gonna catch fish for sure. And I don't know if you notice along the back of the lure, like there's a few spaces in there that I'm noticing, but we're gonna fix that in a second, and I'm gonna show you how. But overall, very nice. You can see the fade down the side just how I want it, how it blends into that bone. There's no harsh lines on the side, and we're gonna make it look even better in a second. Okay, so now that I pretty much like the way the lure is looking at this point, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna hit it again with the detail sepia. And what I'm gonna do now is, again, on light pressure, I'm gonna go down the back of this lure again. And now I already have pretty much a guide, because I already have pretty much a lighter line down the back laid in already. So I'm just gonna go over that and make it darker, and that's gonna fill in all of those spots where maybe the mesh, the contact with the mesh and the lure was a little, a little I don't want to say messed up, but like, it's not how I wanted it, I should say. So now it's pretty much going to darken it up, and it's going to blend everything together, and you won't even know those spots were there. And I'm also, and this is one of my little secrets, not really a secret, but it's just something that I do to make the blend that much better, is what I do is I hit the sides very, very lightly, and this time I hit it straight on, but at such a low pressure and such a little paint that it's barely any paint going on. It's really barely any paint going on there, and it just makes that fade pop just a little bit more. So now that we've corrected that fade in the back of the lure, what I'm doing now is I'm doing a little bit of shading around the eyes. I don't want it dark at all, but just enough so you know that it's there. I don't want it as dark as the back of the lure, but I just really the goal of this shading around the eye is to really just to really go along with the blend down the side. And I'm also going to hit the nose of that lure also. And here you can see the shading on the eyes and the color that I added to the nose. Okay, so now that the lure is pretty much done being painted, we're going to add some eyes to it. These are some red chrome eyes. I really like these eyes, especially with this detailed sepia and this bone color. The eyes stand out and they really look awesome. Like, I really love this combo. I forgot where I got the eyes from. One of those sites. I ordered from like 6 different sites. But these are some really nice solid red eyes, and they're not just like flat eyes. Not that there's anything wrong with flat eyes, but I just like the eyes that pop out a little bit more. To add a little bit more aesthetic to the lure. And I always add a drop of super glue. This is Loctite. I add a drop to that to help with adhesion. But once you epoxy the lure, that eye isn't going anywhere, but little extra insurance doesn't hurt. And here's how the lure looks with the eyes in. You got the sepia and that subtle bone, and then you got these red eyes that just jump out at you. If I was a fish, I would eat it. Alright, so now we're going to get some Blastin'Bass initials on this lure. To put my initials on the lure, I use a Uniball Vision Elite. Just hold it at an angle and get my initials in there. And we're going to be ready for some epoxy. See you there. Okay, so for epoxy, we're going to be using BSI epoxy, the slow cure, 30-minute work time. I love this epoxy. It's the best I've used till date, and I've tried a lot of them. But this one is the one that I'm sticking to for now. I mean, I have had no problems with it. It's a great epoxy. I mean, I've tried KBS. KBS is cool. I like to use KBS for like crankbaits. It's cool for that, but for like stuff like this, that's gonna be used for like saltwater and really get beat up by fish. I like to use BSI for sure. And for this particular lure, I already know how many measurements. It's a two-part epoxy, equal amounts of each. So I use syringes. I believe for this particular lure, I'm using 3 cc's. So I'll use 1.5 cc's of did I say cc's? I think I did. I'll use 1.5 cc's of resin and 1.5 cc's of hardener, and then I'll mix them together. But as you'll see here, I'm using 2 different syringes. I'll put the resin in first, and then I'll put the hardener in. It doesn't matter which order, but just do them separately. And fun fact, that'll also help you preserve syringes. I buy a lot of them, but if you do it this way, if you put just hardener in one syringe and then resin in the other, and then after you're done with it, you store it in a Ziploc bag, like you can use the same syringe for like months. So I'm mixing up the epoxy. I'm using an acid brush, as you can see right there, and then we're gonna start spreading this epoxy on. Okay, so I know people put their epoxy on different ways, but the way I do it is I do the eyes first, and I really make sure that I lay it thick on the eyes to fill in any voids or anything between the eyes, and then I work my way towards the tail of the lure. I generally do this with all my lures because you'll see why in a second. Um, but yeah, I like doing it this way because it ultimately avoids any type of runoff when I hang these lures to dry, because I don't use a lure turner or anything like that. I haven't had to because my method It really works really well. Took a lot of trial and error, and I definitely messed up some lures, but I've eventually I got the hang of it, and yeah, I like this method. I don't have any problems with like uneven spots or anything like that. Um, so yeah, I start with the eyes first, and then I work my way back. Um, I don't really do one side and then rotate it and then do another side. No, I'll just lay a fairly thick layer on all the sides, and I've been doing it like for so long now. I just know how much epoxy I should like lay on each side, and then once I have enough on that side, I'll just spread it down the length of the lure, and that's how I really avoid anything running off the back, and I avoid any like I call them raindrops, And for those of you who epoxy, you know what I'm talking about, like those droplets that you get on there that look hideous. So that's how I avoid that. And also having even brush strokes and making sure that epoxy is spread evenly across the entire length of the lure. So trying to film this process and epoxy this lure, I underestimated how much epoxy I was going to need. I usually nail it every time, but things happen. So I just quickly mixed up a little bit more and to finish this lure because I'd rather have too much than too little. And a quick tip when using this BSI slow cure epoxy, what I've noticed is that the ideal temperature that I like to use this epoxy is like anywhere between 75 and like 79 degrees. I've used it in higher temperatures and it was fine, but anything really lower than like 75, you're gonna have issues with like it getting really sticky and you're really not gonna be able to work the epoxy like you want to. And on a side note, if you've noticed, I'm watching YouTube videos. Usually I'm epoxying like 10 lures at a time, sometimes 20. So I like to watch some YouTube videos, like fishing videos or like lure making videos, just something to help me pass the time. Before we get into what this lure looks like after I put the epoxy on, it's important to note that I put no less than 2 coats on my lures, sometimes 3, especially like with that spook that you see on the table right there. That's something I'll put 3 on because that's used for big fish like big cow-sized striped bass, big fish like that. But yeah, that's minimum 2 coats. And also another thing to note is that what I'm using to hold the lure, those are hemostats. Those are forceps. They're also used by nurses and stuff like that to put in sutures and things of that nature. Okay, so here is a really crucial step in the epoxying process. After I'm done epoxying a lure, I will hit it with a heat gun. This heat gun that I have right here, I got it on Amazon, and it's specifically designed for epoxy. You don't want to hold it too close to the lure, and you also do not want to do it for too long. Basically what this does is it gets rid of air bubbles, and it thins that epoxy out just enough, and it gives it a nice, even look to it. Okay, so here's what the lure looks like after I hit it with the heat gun and I put the epoxy on. Now, the only thing left to do now is hang this lure up. I'm gonna hit it with another coat after it cures. I can do it in like 5 hours, but I usually do it the next day. So I'm just gonna hang it up and put the second coat on the next day. And here's what it looks like.